The Arizona sun in early summer was not a friend. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until it surrendered its last drop of moisture. Eliza Hart knew its language. She understood the way it bleached the wood of her fences to the color of bone and baked the ambition out of the soil, leaving a hard-pan crust that defied a plow. Her small ranch, a half-day's ride from the dusty main street of Sweetwater, was less a homestead and more a stubborn argument with the desert. The cabin, built by her husband, Samuel, before the silver mine took him, was just sturdy enough to turn back the worst of the wind. The well was shallow, the pasture sparse, and the silence was a constant companion, a weight that settled in her bones. At 26, Eliza was a widow, a landowner, and a woman who had learned that survival was a quiet, relentless series of chores. Today, the chore was the water pump. Its groan had become a ragged gasp, and she worked the handle with a grimace, her knuckles scraping against the rusted iron. The wind, already picking up, whipped strands of brown hair across her face, tasting of grit and distance. Inside the cool dimness of the cabin, she took inventory. The sacks of cornmeal were lower than she liked. The box of cartridges for the Winchester felt lighter. Every grain, every bullet, was a calculation against the loneliness and the coming season. Her thoughts, as they often did, drifted to Silas Crowley. He was a man who smiled with his mouth, but not his eyes. A railroad man who saw her patch of earth not as a home, but as an obstacle. He wanted her water. He had made offers, his voice smooth as oiled leather, then veiled threats, delivered by men with cold eyes and guns worn low on their hips. They had ridden out a month ago, leaving behind a trampled garden and a fear that coiled in her stomach like a snake. That fear had changed the rhythm of her life. It had taught her a new set of chores, a liturgy of caution. Before the sun dipped below the Dragoon Mountains, she bolted the heavy door. She did not just own a rifle. She kept it loaded above the mantel and a small pistol tucked in a flour sack near the hearth. Each morning, her first act was not to make coffee, but to walk the perimeter of her property. She scanned the ground not for wildflowers, but for the unfamiliar print of a shod horse. Samuel had taught her how to read the land, but Crowley's men had taught her to read it for threats. It was a harsh education. She saw the world in terms of clearings and cover, of lines of sight and places to hide. The quiet of the desert no longer felt like peace. It felt like a held breath. The wind began to howl, a low moan that escalated into a shriek. The sky, a placid blue moments before, turned a bruised, sickly yellow. Dust devils danced on the horizon, growing into a solid wall of sand that consumed the landscape. A summer dust storm, sudden and violent. Eliza secured the latch on the chicken coop, the hens clucking in nervous protest. She pulled the heavy wooden shutter across the window, plunging the cabin into twilight. The world outside was being erased, scoured clean by the wind. And through the growing roar, she saw it, a shape emerging from the ochre gloom at the edge of her property. It was tall, impossibly so, a silhouette moving with a strange, deliberate grace against the tide of the storm. Then another, smaller, followed close behind. She moved without thinking, her hand finding the cool, familiar grip of the pistol in the flour sack. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the thunder of the wind. They were walking, not riding. That was wrong. Everyone rode. She peered through a crack in the shutter as they drew closer. The first figure was a man, a giant of a man. His frame broad and powerful. His long black hair was held back by a simple band, and even through the stinging dust she could see the dark, intricate patterns on the armband he wore. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his right leg. The second was a boy, lanky and young, walking in the larger man's shadow. They were Apache. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach, a repository of every whispered story and fearful rumor she had ever heard. They stopped just beyond her fence line, the man raising a hand, not in greeting, but as a clear, unambiguous signal of peace. He waited. He did not approach the gate. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the storm, letting her see him. He carried a bow and a rifle, but they were held loosely, pointed toward the ground. After a long moment, he said something to the boy, then began to walk toward her porch. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step a declaration of non-aggression. When he reached the wooden steps of her porch, he stopped again, carefully. He unslung his rifle and bow and laid them on the ground. He took a knife from his belt and placed it beside them. Only then did he step onto the porch, out of the worst of the stinging sand, but still exposed. He stood before her door, a man disarmed by his own choice, and waited for her to acknowledge him. The boy remained by the fence, watching. Eliza's knuckles were white where she gripped the pistol. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to wait for them to leave. But the storm was a living thing now, a furious beast that shook the very foundations of the cabin. No one could survive long out in that. Her fear of Crowley, her fear of strangers, her fear of this land, all of it churned inside her. But overriding it was a simple, stark truth. She was a woman alone, but she was not an animal. She could not leave them to the mercy of the storm. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the door and opened it a crack. The pistol still held tight and low, hidden by the wood of the door. The man was even taller up close. His face was stark and handsome, carved from the rock and canyons of this land. His dark eyes steady and unreadable. He did not look at the gun she knew he must suspect she was holding. He looked at her face, a direct and unnerving gaze. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, calm and clear above the wind. He said, "Can we rest here tonight just until the storm passes?" She lived alone. The thought was a stark and simple fact. She had built her life around that fact, fortified herself within it. Now, that fortress was being breached by a simple question. She looked past him to the boy, who huddled against the fence post, his face turned away from the wind. She looked at the weapons lying peacefully in the dust. Her mind raced, a frantic tally of risks. An Apache warrior, a giant of a man, asking for shelter. It was the beginning of a story she did not want to be in, but the wind howled its own argument, and the dust was so thick it was becoming hard to breathe. To turn them away was to sentence them. She made a decision, a choice born of pragmatism and a sliver of humanity she refused to let this land grind out of her. "The barn," she said, her own voice tight and unfamiliar. "You can stay in the barn." The man nodded once, a slow, formal gesture of acceptance. He turned, gathered his weapons, and walked back to the boy. Eliza watched them cross to the barn, the massive wooden doors groaning as they pushed them open and slipped inside, disappearing from view. She quickly bolted her own door, her back pressed against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her home was no longer just her own. An hour later, the wind began to subside, its fury spent. The yellow gloom outside softened to a gray twilight. The silence that returned was different, heavier, charged with the presence of the strangers in her barn. She built up the fire, the crackle of the wood a small comfort. She could not simply ignore them. Hospitality, even the most cautious kind, had its own rules. She put the last of her coffee onto boil and sliced off 2 thick pieces of cornbread. With the pistol now tucked into the waistband of her skirt, she walked out into the clean, washed air. The ground was damp. The dust settled into a dark, rich mud. As she neared the well to draw a bucket of water, she stopped. There, in the soft earth, were the tracks she had been looking for every morning. Not the moccasins of her guests, but the distinct print of a man's boot, with a worn heel, and another set. A few feet away, they had been recent. Someone had stood here, watching her cabin, hidden by the small grove of mesquite trees. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. When she approached the barn, the tall man was standing just inside the open doorway. As if he had been waiting, he watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He spoke before she could. "There were men watching your house, from the trees. They left when the storm came." His eyes flicked toward the well. "Their tracks are still there." Eliza froze. the tin of cornbread feeling flimsy in her hands. She had not been imagining it. The threat was real. Silas Crowley. It had to be. The man's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He said, "They will be back." She knew he was right. The knowledge settled heavily in her gut. She looked from the imposing figure of the warrior to the comforting solidity of her cabin, the lines she had drawn around her life, between safe and unsafe, between herself and the world, had just been blurred. She held out the cornbread and a canteen of water she had filled. He accepted them, his large hand gentle as he took them from her. He said a word in his own language, a word that sounded like gratitude, deep and resonant. He then turned and spoke to the boy inside, who emerged from the shadows. He was just a boy. Eliza saw now, with wide, curious eyes and the lanky awkwardness of youth. He gave her a shy, fleeting smile. Eliza retreated to the warmth of her kitchen, the smell of coffee a familiar comfort in a world that had suddenly become strange. She sat at her small table, the pistol resting on the wood in front of her. Through the open doorway, she could see the faint glow of a small, carefully contained fire in the barn. Two worlds had touched. There was no trust yet, not even understanding. But in the shared threat of the desert and the men who haunted it, and in the simple exchange of food and a warning, a fragile respect had been forged. She was still alone in her house, but she was no longer alone on this patch of unforgiving land. Sleep did not come easily. The familiar sounds of the house, the creak of the wood settling, the whisper of the wind around the eaves, were all overlaid with a new awareness. The knowledge of the two men in her barn was a palpable presence, a weight on the silence. Eliza lay awake for hours, the pistol on the small table beside her bed, and listened. She heard nothing but the night. Before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, she was up, dressed, and moving with a quiet purpose. This uneasy truce needed rules, her rules. She stepped out into the crisp, pre-dawn air. The world smelled clean, washed by the storm. A faint light from their small fire flickered from the barn's entrance. Taza was there, standing just inside the shadow of the doorway, as still as the rock formations in the distance. He had been watching the land. She realized, not sleeping. He saw her coming but did not move, simply waiting as she crossed the space between their two temporary worlds. She stopped a respectful distance from the barn. She said that they were welcome to the shelter of the barn and to water from the well for as long as they needed. But the house was her own. She made it clear that they were not to enter it, especially not after dark, not while she slept. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the fear that still fluttered in her chest. Taza listened, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He gave a single, slow nod of understanding. He then turned slightly, and with a fluid motion, took a small, heavy-bladed axe from his belt, a tomahawk. He reached up and placed it on a high, dusty ledge inside the barn, well above his own head and far from his easy reach. He did this without a word, his action a clear and binding signature on their agreement. The gesture spoke of a deep, ingrained code of honor, and it resonated with Eliza more than any spoken promise could have. Trust, she was learning, was not a grand declaration but a currency of small, quiet deeds. Later that morning, after the sun had climbed above the mountains, the boy, Kohana, approached the groaning water pump. He regarded it with the intense curiosity of the young, his eyes tracing the path of the handle to the spout. He tentatively placed a hand on the iron lever, pushing it slightly, intrigued by its creak of resistance. Eliza came out of her cabin, a basket of laundry on her hip. She told him gently to leave it be. She explained, a small, wry smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity, that the old pump was even more cantankerous and ill-tempered than she was, and it was best not to provoke it. Kohana snatched his hand back, a wide, infectious grin spreading across his face, from the barn doorway. Taza watched the exchange, and for a fleeting moment, Eliza thought she saw a flicker of warmth in his stoic gaze. The small joke, a simple human connection, had momentarily cleared the tense air between them. A strange, unspoken rhythm began to define their days. Eliza went about her chores, weeding her small garden, mending a fence post, feeding her chickens. Taza and Kohana kept to the barn and the area immediately around it. They were never idle. She saw them restringing a bow, sharpening knives with a smooth, patient rhythm, and treating a patch of worn leather on a moccasin. They moved with a quiet self-sufficiency that was both fascinating and deeply alien to her. They were a self-contained unit, needing nothing from her but the space she had granted them. Her mind, however, was a less peaceful place. As she worked, she battled with the ghosts of old fears. She had been raised on stories of Apache raids, of violence and savagery. Those stories were a part of the very air she breathed in this territory. But the men in her barn did not fit the terrifying figures of those tales. She found herself watching Taza. There was a profound stillness about him, a deep and abiding dignity. His eyes, when they happened to meet hers, were clear and direct. They held no malice, none of the leering contempt she had seen in the eyes of Silas Crowley's men. Taza looked at her and saw a person. Crowley's men had looked at her and seen an obstacle, or worse, a prize. The contradiction churned inside her, a battle between the woman she had been taught to be and the woman her own eyes were telling her to become. Taza, for his part, was an expert in the art of avoidance. His entire life had been a lesson in navigating the dangerous currents of the white man's world. He had promised to protect his young cousin, to see him safely to their relatives in the mountains, and this isolated ranch was a necessary, if dangerous, pause in their journey. He understood the woman's fear. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way she never fully turned her back on them. So he focused on creating an aura of harmlessness. He and Kohana spoke softly. They kept their fire small and smokeless. He made a point to always be visible, to never move suddenly. His priority was simple and absolute: cause no trouble. In the late afternoon, Taza walked the perimeter of the property, his long strides eating up the ground. He did not move like a man out for a stroll. He moved like a hunter, his eyes scanning every rock, every bush, every shadow. He was gone for some time. When he returned, he came directly to where she was patching a tear in a grain sack on her porch. He opened his hand. Lying in his palm was a small brass cylinder, glinting in the sun, a cartridge casing. He told her it was a .44 caliber, for a Winchester rifle, same as hers. He added that it was new. The brass was still bright, untarnished by the sun or rain. Someone had fired a shot here, and recently. He did not need to say more. The message was clear. The watchers were armed, and they were close. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he offered a piece of advice. He noticed the single lantern she lit in her window each night. He told her that a man watching a house from a distance uses that light to aim. He suggested that when night fell, she should place her lamp not on the table by the window, but on the floor, in the far corner of the room. He explained that this would change the angle of the light, creating confusing shadows. It would make it impossible for anyone outside to know exactly where she was standing or sitting. It was a piece of knowledge born from a hard life, a trade secret of survival, and he offered it to her freely. She took his advice. That night, the little cabin was lit by a strange, flickering glow from the floorboards. The familiar room was transformed into a place of looming shadows and uncertain shapes. When she slid the heavy bolt on her door, the sound seemed louder than usual. It was a necessary act of self-preservation, but it felt incomplete. On an impulse, she filled a dipper with fresh, cool water from the bucket and set it on the porch rail, a silent offering against the darkness. The door between them was locked, but her heart, she was beginning to realize, was not. Through a small crack in the window shutter, she could see the dark shape of the barn against the star-dusted sky. The wind had picked up again, a low, mournful sound, and heat lightning flashed silently on the horizon. illuminating the clouds for a brief, spectral moment. In one of those flashes, she saw Taza sitting just inside the barn entrance. He had a small gash on his forearm, long and clean, perhaps from a sharp rock on their journey. He was tending to it. She watched as he took a piece of a green, fleshy plant from a pouch, crushed it between two stones into a pulp, and carefully, meticulously, applied the paste to the wound. He then wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth, his movements economical and precise. There was no drama in the act, no hint of pain or complaint. It was a simple, practical task, performed with an air of quiet competence. Watching him, Eliza felt an unfamiliar stirring, a feeling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a deep, burgeoning respect. This was a man who knew how to survive, who knew how to heal himself. In the harsh, unforgiving landscape of her life, that quiet strength was more compelling than any words could ever be. The quiet moments were the most unsettling. During the day, the rhythm of work provided a distraction, a steady beat of chopping wood, pulling weeds, mending cloth, that kept her thoughts occupied. But in the evenings, a fragile stillness would descend upon the small ranch. Eliza would sit on her porch, watching the sky fade from orange to purple, and Taza would sit just inside the cavernous mouth of the barn. They would occupy the silence together, two solitary figures separated by a stretch of packed earth, but united by the vast, empty landscape that surrounded them. It was during one of these evenings that Kohana, restless and full of a boy's boundless energy, asked the question that had been hanging unspoken in the air. He had been watching her stare at the distant silhouette of the mining operation, a dark scar on the mountainside. He asked her if she had family there. Eliza took a slow breath, the air cool against her lungs. She said her husband, Samuel, was there. She explained that he was a miner, that he had gone into the earth one morning and had never come out. She told them about the collapse, the way the ground had just given way, swallowing a dozen men whole. The company had called it an accident, a tragedy. They had given each of the widows a small sum of money, a pittance meant to quiet their grief and their questions. She had taken her share, every last dollar, and bought this piece of land. It was the only thing she had left of him. It was bought with his life. She did not tell them the part that she kept locked away, the bitter knowledge that the mine foreman had been cutting corners on the support timbers, rushing the men to pull more silver from the rock. And she did not mention that Silas Crowley had been the one pushing the foreman, his railroad a hungry beast that demanded more money, more speed, more everything. No matter the cost in men's lives, that knowledge was a poison she kept to herself. When she finished speaking, the silence that followed was different. It was not empty, but filled with a shared understanding of loss. It was Taza who broke it. His voice was low, and he looked not at her, but out at the darkening land as if seeing his own ghosts there. He told her that he, too, knew what it was to lose family to the carelessness of others. His older brother, a skilled hunter and a quiet man, had been shot by a patrol near a stream. They had mistaken him for a raider. They said later, an unfortunate mistake. Taza's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Eliza could feel the cold fury that lay beneath the surface. He explained that he was taking Kohana to their family in the Chiricahua Mountains, a place of safety. He would not let his cousin be rounded up and sent to one of the reservations, the sad, dusty settlements where his people were being forced to live, their freedom traded for government rations and despair. Their stories, so different in their details, were the same in their painful heart. Both of them were survivors, haunted by the shadows of men who believed their own greed was more important than another person's life. In that shared twilight, the distance between the porch and the barn seemed to shrink. The next afternoon, the threat they all knew was coming finally showed its face. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, their figures stark against the blue sky. They were not just passing by. They rode with a swaggering confidence, their path leading directly toward the cabin. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. She recognized 2 of them from Crowley's last visit. Taza and Kohana melted back into the shadows of the barn, becoming invisible. Eliza forced herself to remain on the porch, her hands busy with a piece of mending, trying to appear calm, unafraid. The riders did not come to the house. They veered toward the barn, their intentions clear. They were there to intimidate, to probe. They dismounted, their spurs jingling, and began to walk toward the open barn doors, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. They were laughing, making loud jokes meant for her to overhear. Then Taza moved. He did not emerge from the front of the barn, but from the side, a silent, swift shadow. He was on them before they knew he was there. There was no shout, no warning. One moment the men were advancing. The next they were on the ground, disarmed. Taza moved with a blinding, economical grace. A hard shove, a quick twist of a wrist. A foot swept from under a leg. He did not strike a single blow with his fist. He simply used their own momentum against them, neutralizing them with a humiliating efficiency. He gathered their pistols and rifles, his movements calm and deliberate. Kohana appeared then, a knife in his hand, while Taza stood over the sprawling, cursing men. The boy quickly and expertly sliced through the leather cinches of their saddles, leaving them hanging loose and useless. Taza then tossed their weapons far into the dense mesquite brush. He looked down at the men, his face a mask of cold contempt. He told them to walk home. He told them to tell their master that this land was protected. The men scrambled to their feet, their faces a mixture of fury and fear. They stumbled away, casting hateful glances over their shoulders before disappearing over the rise, leaving their horses and their dignity behind. Eliza knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was not the end. Taza had not created a victory, only a more personal and venomous enemy. A few days later, her supplies running low, Eliza knew she had to make the trip into Sweetwater. She left at dawn, the Winchester rifle resting in its scabbard on her saddle. The town was a collection of dusty, false-fronted buildings huddled along a single main street. Her first stop was the small church, where Reverend Hale, a man with kind eyes and a weak chin, listened to her story with a pained expression. He wrung his hands and spoke of caution. He advised her to be practical. Perhaps it would be safer, he suggested, to accept Mr. Crowley's offer. The railroad was a powerful force for progress, and it was unwise to stand in its way. His words were meant to be comforting, but they felt like a betrayal. Her second stop was the general store, a cluttered, welcoming space that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and salted pork. Martha Bell, the owner, was a stout, no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and a generous heart. While she weighed out flour and beans for Eliza, she spoke in a low voice. She had heard the talk. She knew what Crowley was doing. As Eliza paid, Martha slipped an extra slab of bacon and a small bag of coffee beans into her sack. She told Eliza to be careful. She said that not everyone in this town was on the side of the man with the most money. The small act of solidarity was a balm on Eliza's frayed nerves. Martha was a friend. The sky had been a clear, brilliant blue when she left Sweetwater, but by the time she was halfway home, it had turned a strange, bruised purple. The air grew still and heavy, and a sudden, violent wind swept down from the mountains. Then came the hail. It started as small, tapping pebbles, then grew to the size of marbles, then acorns. It hammered down with a furious, deafening roar, blanketing the ground in a carpet of white. Her horse whinnied in panic, and she had to fight to keep it under control as she galloped the last mile home, the ice stones stinging her face and hands. She burst into her cabin, soaked and shivering, just as Taza and Kohana ran from the barn, their heads covered with blankets. The hailstorm was a full-fledged assault, a bombardment from the heavens. The noise inside the small cabin was incredible, a constant, deafening drumming on the wooden roof. And then, a new sound, a sharp crack followed by a splintering of wood. A chunk of ice the size of a man's fist smashed through the roof, landing on the floor in a spray of shingles and ice chips. Then another, and another. The sky was falling in. When the storm finally passed, as suddenly as it had begun. An eerie silence fell. The three of them stood in the wrecked kitchen, looking at the holes in the roof, through which the last of the afternoon light streamed. The floor was littered with ice and debris. Without a word, Taza went outside and returned with the ladder he had seen propped against the barn. He placed it against the cabin and climbed up to survey the damage. Eliza grabbed a bucket and began to clear the floor, and Kohana picked up the larger pieces of wood. They worked together for the rest of the day and into the evening. Taza, perched on the roof, expertly patched the holes with spare lumber he found in the barn. Eliza handed him tools and nails, and Kohana ferried supplies back and forth. They moved in a silent, coordinated effort, a team forged by necessity. They were mending the house, but it felt like they were mending something deeper, patching the holes in their small, fragile world. Night fell, and a cold rain began to fall, a gentle weeping after the storm's violent rage. The patches held. They gathered in the kitchen, exhausted and damp, the room lit by the warm glow of her lantern. The air was filled with the smell of wet wood, rain, and fresh coffee. Eliza looked at Taza and Kohana, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes soaked. She could not send them back to the cold, damp barn. Not tonight. She told them they could sleep on the floor by the hearth, where it was warm and dry. Taza looked at her, a long, searching look, and then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Later, as she lay in her bed, she listened to the soft sounds of their breathing, a steady, rhythmic presence in her house. For the first time since they had arrived, she had not slid the heavy bolt on her door. The lock remained undone. Just before he had settled down to sleep, Taza had looked at the patched roof, then at her. He said that, in the way of his people, the law of the land was simple. He who holds the water holds life. All other laws come after that. He said that a man who tries to steal water from the earth and from the people is breaking the most sacred law of all. He was not just talking about Silas Crowley. He was talking about a fight for the heart of the land itself. And Eliza knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that it was her fight now, too. A new kind of school convened on the hard-pan soil of Eliza Hart's ranch. The lessons were not in rhetoric or arithmetic, but in the stark grammar of survival. Taza began to teach her the language of the land as he knew it. He showed her how a single overturned stone could tell of a rider's passing, and how the depth of a hoofprint could speak to the weight of the man it carried. He taught her to shoot not just accurately, but quietly. He demonstrated how to muffle the sharp crack of the Winchester by firing from behind a thick earthen bank, a trick that could confuse an enemy as to her true position. He had her wrap the rifle's action in a piece of greased leather when not in use, a simple preventative against the fine, insidious dust that could jam a mechanism at the worst possible moment. She was a focused student, her attention sharpened by the knowledge that these were not theoretical exercises. Each lesson was a tool, a weapon against the men who watched from the ridges. In return, Eliza's kitchen became a classroom of a different sort. She taught Kohana his letters, scratching the shapes of the English alphabet into a shallow tray of sand with a stick. The boy was a quick and eager learner, his bright eyes following her hand, his voice carefully mimicking the strange new sounds. He learned the mystery of numbers by weighing sacks of cornmeal on her small balance scale, his brow furrowed in concentration. The exchange was unspoken but deeply felt. They were no longer just host and guests. They were allies, sharing the most valuable things they possessed, their knowledge and their time. The tension that had defined their first days together began to soften at the edges, replaced by a cautious familiarity. The change was marked not by a grand event, but by a small moment of unexpected humor. Eliza's rooster, a proud and aggressive bird with the iridescent black and green tail feathers, had a habit of strutting around the yard as if he owned the entire territory. One morning, as it puffed out its chest and let out a particularly imperious crow, Kohana pointed and said a single, solemn word in English. "General." Eliza looked at the pompous bird, then at Kohana's serious face. and a sound escaped her that she had not heard in months. It was a laugh, a real one, starting deep in her chest and bubbling up until it spilled out into the clear morning air. It felt rusty and strange, but wonderful. Taza, who was mending a strap nearby, looked up, and the corner of his mouth twitched in the barest hint of a smile. The sound of her laughter seemed to chase some of the shadows from the corners of the ranch. That fragile peace was shattered in the dead of night. Eliza awoke to a smell that every person in the dry West fears above all others. Smoke, but it was not the familiar scent of her hearth. It was the acrid, hungry smell of burning hay and dry wood. She threw on her clothes and burst out the door. The barn was on fire. Flames were licking up the far wall, an angry orange tongue against the blackness of the night, greedily consuming the old, dry timber. Taza and Kohana were already there, pulling buckets of water from the well in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Eliza grabbed the heavy wool blankets from her bed and soaked them at the pump, her movements clumsy with panic. The three of them worked in a silent, choking fury, beating at the base of the flames with the heavy, wet blankets. The heat was a physical blow, searing their skin and stealing the air from their lungs. Smoke filled their eyes and throats, a thick, blinding fog. Taza was a whirlwind of controlled energy, directing their efforts, attacking the heart of the blaze with a ferocity that seemed to match the fire itself. Eliza felt a tremor of fear run through her, a cold, sickening wave that threatened to paralyze her, but then she looked at Taza, at the unwavering determination in his face, and she found a strength she did not know she possessed. She would not collapse. This was her home. This was her barn. She would not let Crowley burn it to the ground. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to win. The raging flames subsided into a sullen, smoking ruin. They doused the last of the glowing embers, the hiss of water on hot wood the only sound in the night. The fire was out. They stood in the wreckage. 3 soot-stained figures, chests heaving, the stink of smoke clinging to them like a shroud. A large section of the barn wall was gone, and the ground was a blackened, soggy mess. Taza had a burn along his forearm, a raw, angry red mark where a flaming piece of wood had fallen against him. Eliza looked at the damage, at the deliberate, malicious nature of the act, and she began to tremble, the adrenaline giving way to a profound, shaking shock. Taza saw it. He took a step toward her, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. He stopped before her, his presence a dark, solid shape in the faint moonlight. He raised his hand slowly, as if not to startle a wild creature, and hesitated for a moment. He asked quietly, not as a demand but as a question, "May I?" Eliza could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was firm, steady, and through the thin fabric of her dress, she could feel the warmth and strength in his palm. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. She leaned into it, just slightly, and felt her frantic heartbeat begin to slow, the frantic rhythm easing into a steadier beat. He said nothing, simply stood there with her in the ruins, his quiet presence a shield against the darkness. Inside the cabin, by the light of the lantern, the reality of the night settled upon them. Eliza brought out her small tin of medical supplies. She had a salve made from sage and lard that her mother had taught her to make, good for burns and scrapes. She cleaned Taza's arm with a clean, damp cloth. He sat perfectly still, his face betraying no hint of the pain she knew he must be feeling. As she began to apply the salve, he watched her, his gaze intense. The sharp, clean scent of the sage filled the small kitchen. She wrapped the burn with a strip of linen, her fingers working carefully. As she went to tie the final knot, her hands were still trembling slightly. Taza moved to do it himself, but she stopped him. "Let me," she said, her voice soft but firm. She secured the bandage, her touch lingering for a second longer than necessary on his arm. It was a small act, but it felt like a significant shift. They were no longer just allies in a fight. They were partners in healing. The news of the fire traveled to Sweetwater, But the story that came back was a twisted, ugly version of the truth. The talk in the saloon, passed along to her later by a worried Martha Bell, was that the Apache she was harboring had grown careless with his fire. The rumor, planted and watered by Crowley's men, was that she was putting the whole territory at risk. The fear and prejudice that had always simmered beneath the surface of the community now had a focus. She and her guests were becoming a convenient scapegoat. The official response was not long in coming. Sheriff Dugan rode out to her ranch a few days later. He was a large man with a florid face and small, shifty eyes, a man who wore his badge like an ornament rather than a responsibility. He did not dismount, but sat on his horse, looking down at her with an air of condescending authority. He said he had heard about her trouble. He said that for her own safety and for the good of the community, she ought to reconsider Mr. Crowley's generous offer for her land. He delivered the warning with a thin smile, making it clear that his purpose was not to protect her, but to enforce Crowley's will. He called it protecting the peace. Eliza knew he meant protecting the railroad's profits. After he had gone, leaving a cloud of dust and a sense of foulness in the air, Eliza made her decision. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it had been joined by a hard, unyielding anger. This was her home. She had paid for it with her husband's life, and she had defended it with her own hands. She would not be scared away. That evening, she told Taza. She told him that she would not sell, that she would not sign any papers, no matter what they did. Taza listened, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. He told her that she was not fighting alone. He said that a man like Crowley, a man who broke the law of the land, did not hide his crimes well. He promised her that if the chance came, he would help her find the proof she needed to show the people of Sweetwater what kind of man Silas Crowley truly was. That night, the sky was a canvas of deep, starless black. Far in the distance, heat lightning flashed, illuminating the jagged peaks of the mountains for a brief, silent moment. It was a dry storm, holding all of its power in reserve. The air on the ranch was heavy, still, and charged with an unspoken promise. A confrontation was coming. The pressure was building, and sooner or later, the storm would have to break. The truce of shared labor and quiet respect could not last. Silas Crowley was not a man to be deterred by a burned barn or a few humiliated hirelings. He was a man of contracts and capital, and he believed the world could be reshaped by the force of a signature on a piece of paper, especially when that signature was coerced. He arrived one bright, cloudless afternoon, not with thugs, but with the cloying veneer of legality. Sheriff Dugan was with him, as was a weaselly little man with a notepad and a perpetually nervous twitch. Crowley dismounted and strode onto Eliza's porch as if he already owned it. He held out a sheaf of papers. He called it his final offer, a number so insultingly low it was more of a taunt than a negotiation. But the price was not the true poison in the document. He had added a new clause. A monthly protection fee he claimed was for safeguarding her property from the very dangers he himself was manufacturing. It was a preposterous demand, designed to be refused. When Eliza's face hardened and she made no move to take the papers, Crowley played his real card. He gestured to the nervous man with the notepad. Introducing him as a witness, he announced, his voice loud enough to carry to the barn, that he was here to officially document the presence of non-resident Apache on her land. He said it was a matter of public safety. The witness began to scribble furiously. Crowley's plan was now chillingly clear. He was creating a legal pretext. He would use the town's fear and prejudice to paint her as a sympathizer who was harboring dangerous elements. Then he would petition the territorial authorities to have her land condemned and seized as a security risk, at which point he could acquire it for a pittance. It was a neat, vicious trap, and he was smiling as he sprung it. Eliza stood her ground, her voice cold as well water. She told him to take his papers and his witness and get off her land. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for a weapon. She simply stood, a small, unmovable object in the path of his ambition. Crowley's smile tightened. He left the papers on her porch rail, a white flag of surrender that was actually a declaration of war. He said he would be back with the full weight of the law. 2 days later, in Sweetwater, a small miracle occurred. As Eliza was loading supplies into her wagon, Martha Bell intercepted her behind the store. She pressed a small, leather-bound ledger into Eliza's hands, her eyes darting nervously up and down the alley. She told Eliza she had thought something was amiss for months. The book was her private inventory log. For the past year, Martha had been noting down the unusually large water deliveries made to the railroad's work camp, deliveries far exceeding what their own small well could provide. The entries corresponded with days the town's public well was reported to be low. Crowley was not just after Eliza's water. He had been stealing from the whole town, but there was more. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a shipping manifest Martha had salvaged from a discarded crate behind the saloon. It was for a consignment of dynamite, delivered to the Silver Peak Mining Company a week before the collapse that had killed Samuel. Stamped on the bottom of the manifest, clear as day, was the official seal of the San Pedro Valley Rail Office. It was the concrete proof, the iron link she had always suspected but could never prove. Crowley's railroad and the mining company were not just partners. They were complicit in the negligence that had made her a widow. The fight was no longer just about her land. It was about justice for her husband. Back at the ranch, the community of Sweetwater began to fracture. The saloon owner, whose profits were tied to the railroad crews, openly sided with Crowley. Spreading the rumors about Eliza, a large rancher who saw the railroad as a guarantee of higher cattle prices, offered his public support. But a quieter current of resistance was also forming. Small farmers, who understood the sacred value of a water source, began to stop by Eliza's property. Not to talk, but to leave a basket of eggs or a sack of potatoes on her porch in a silent show of solidarity. A few of the independent miners, men who had known Samuel and despised the company foreman, let it be known that they did not believe the saloon talk. The town was drawing a line in its own dust. The weight of it all began to press down on Eliza. That evening, Taza found her by the fence, staring out at the land as if it were a vast and hostile sea. He stood beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. He told her that he and Kohana should leave. He said that their presence was being used as a weapon against her. He could not, in good conscience, be the cause of her losing her home. He was prepared to slip away into the mountains, to draw the trouble with him. Eliza turned to him, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. She shook her head, a sharp, definitive motion. She told him that was not how it was going to be. She said this was their fight now. All of them. Home, she said, her voice thick with emotion, is the place where we protect each other. It is not a station where you trade people away to save yourself. The words hung in the air between them, a powerful, unbreakable vow. Taza looked at her, and in his dark eyes, she saw not just respect, but a deep and profound allegiance. He nodded, and the matter was settled. Help came from the most unexpected of quarters. Reverend Hale, shamed by his own timidity and spurred by Eliza's courage, rode out to the ranch. He carried a heavy, dust-covered book of territorial statutes. He had spent 2 days reading, his conscience his guide. He had found something. He pointed to a small, densely printed passage. It stated that while the authorities could take action in the face of a clear and present danger, the forced sale or seizure of private land for security reasons required a formal petition and a ruling from a circuit court judge. Crowley could not simply use the sheriff as his personal repo man. He needed a court order, something that would require evidence and testimony, something that would bring his actions out into the light. It was a thin shield, but it was a shield nonetheless. The true threat, however, was not legal, but physical. The water pump, once merely cantankerous, was now failing. Each pull of the handle brought up less water, the gasp of the mechanism weaker and more strained. The water level in the well was dropping at an unnatural rate. Her few cattle grew listless, their heads hanging low in the oppressive heat. It was Taza who found the cause. He spent a morning circling the well, his eyes on the ground, reading the subtle signs that she had missed. He found a patch of earth 50 yards away that was unnaturally damp. Following the line of moisture, he began to dig with his hands. A foot below the surface, he uncovered it, an iron pipe, narrow and new, buried in the dirt. It was siphoning water directly from the aquifer that fed her well, bleeding her life source away. The pipe led east, in the direction of the railroad tracks. Crowley was not just trying to buy her water. He was stealing it from under her feet, strangling her into submission. That night, a full moon rose, casting the landscape in a stark, silvery light. There was no more time for defense. It was time to act. Eliza, Taza, and Kohana gathered in the kitchen, a council of war. The plan was simple and desperate. They would follow the pipe. They would find where it led and gather the proof they needed to expose Crowley once and for all. They packed canteens of water and a small bag of food. Eliza took her pistol, and Taza his bow and knife. They moved out into the moonlight, 3 shadows against the pale earth. The iron pipe was a dark, glistening line in the moonlight, a stolen artery carrying the lifeblood of her land away into the darkness. The tension was a living thing, a tightly wound spring in Eliza's chest. They were no longer waiting for the fight to come to them. They were walking out to meet it. The moon was a cold, silver coin in the black sky, bright enough to turn the iron pipe into a glistening serpent leading them across the desert. They moved in silence, a small, determined procession of ghosts. Taza went first, his feet seeming to find purchase on the most barren ground without a sound. Eliza followed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. And Kohana brought up the rear, his youthful energy now honed to a sharp, watchful focus. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of dust and creosote. For nearly 2 hours, they followed the pipe as it snaked through arroyos and around clusters of prickly pear. It led them away from the open range and toward a narrow canyon carved into the foothills of the mountains. Ahead, they could see the dark, angular shapes of man-made structures, a water tower and a small shack. Huddled near the canyon wall, a single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow over the small compound. Taza held up a hand, and they melted into the shadows of a rock outcropping. He pointed. A lone figure sat on a crate near the shack, a rifle resting across his lap, his head occasionally nodding forward as he fought off sleep. Taza whispered to Kohana, his voice a low breath of air, telling him to stay back and watch their trail. The boy nodded, his face serious in the moonlight, and disappeared behind a boulder. Taza then turned to Eliza. He passed her a pair of heavy iron pliers from his pack. He said he would take care of the guard. Her job was to get to the lock on the pump house door. He told her to be quick. Before she could answer, he was gone, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. She watched, her breath held tight in her chest. As he moved, he did not walk or run. He flowed over the ground, using every bit of cover. He circled wide, coming up behind the guard through a dense patch of cholla cactus, their spiny arms like grasping skeletons in the moonlight. She saw him rise up behind the unsuspecting man. A swift, silent motion. There was no struggle, just a single, sharp movement, and the guard slumped forward, unconscious. Taza lowered him gently to the ground, a gesture of respect even for an enemy. It was her turn. She ran, her feet light on the sandy soil, the pliers cold and heavy in her hand. She reached the pump house door. It was secured with a thick chain and a heavy brass padlock. Her hands trembled as she worked the jaws of the pliers around the shackle of the lock. It was thick, stubborn metal. She put all of her weight into it, gritting her teeth, the muscles in her arms and back straining. The metal groaned in protest. She squeezed again, a small, desperate sob escaping her lips. With a sharp snap, the shackle broke. She pulled the chain free and eased the door open. The air inside was thick with the smell of oil and stagnant water. A lantern on a dusty desk illuminated a small, cramped space, and on the desk, held down by a rock, was a sheaf of papers. She shuffled through them with frantic energy. shipping manifests, supply lists. And then she found it. A contract. It was a maintenance agreement between the San Pedro Valley Rail Office and the Silver Peak Mining Company. Her eyes scanned the page, her heart pounding. It detailed the installation and upkeep of a secret pumping system. And at the bottom were 2 signatures, one a florid, arrogant scrawl she recognized as Silas Crowley's, the other belonging to the mine foreman. The same man who had sworn the collapse was a tragic act of God. She had it, the proof that connected them, the proof of the stolen water. Tucked inside the folded contract was another document, a purchase order for a cheap, unstable grade of dynamite, also signed by the foreman. It was all there, a conspiracy written in ink. A horse whinnied outside, a sharp, sudden sound that made her jump. Then she heard the crunch of boots on gravel, heavy, confident steps. The door to the shack was thrown open, and Silas Crowley stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight. Sheriff Dugan was right behind him, his pistol already drawn. Crowley's eyes landed on Eliza, then on the papers in her hand. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He said, Well, look what we have here, the little widow, playing detective, and her big, silent shadow." His eyes flicked to Taza, who had moved to stand just behind Eliza, his body a solid shield. Crowley's smile widened, full of venom. He mocked them, his voice dripping with condescending amusement, calling them a pathetic little heroine and her pet savage, trying to stand in the way of progress. He stepped into the shack, the smell of whiskey sharp on his breath. He was arrogant, flush with victory, certain of his absolute power in this small, forgotten corner of the world. He snatched the papers from Eliza's hand and glanced at them. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. He told her these papers meant nothing. He said that in a week. This entire valley would be his. He took a swig from a silver flask he pulled from his coat. It was the whiskey and the intoxicating power of his own perceived cleverness that undid him. He looked at Eliza, his eyes glittering with a spiteful triumph. He told her she was a fool, just like her husband. He said Samuel Hart had been a whiner, always complaining about the timbers and the blasting patterns. Crowley boasted that he had told the foreman to speed things up, that a few risks were necessary to keep the silver flowing and the tracks moving forward. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that filled the small shack. He confessed, with a proud smirk, that men like her husband were just the unfortunate but necessary cost of building a future. He had as good as admitted to murdering her husband. The confession, born of pure, unadulterated hubris, hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Before Eliza could even react, a new voice cut through the tension, calm and clear from the darkness outside the doorway. A woman's voice. "Martha Bell," she said. "We all heard that. Silas." Crowley spun around. Standing at the edge of the lantern light were Martha, Reverend Hale, and 3 grim-faced miners, their faces hard and unforgiving in the moonlight. They had followed Eliza from town, worried for her safety. They had arrived just in time to hear everything. Reverend Hale held a small notepad and a pencil, his hand steady. Crowley's face went slack, the color draining from it, leaving a pasty, shocked pallor. The arrogant smile vanished, replaced by the snarl of a cornered animal. Sheriff Dugan, flustered and caught, raised his pistol, shouting for everyone to stay back. Chaos erupted. Taza did not wait. He grabbed the lantern from the desk and hurled it not at the men, but at a pile of oily rags in the corner of the shack. They ignited with a whoosh, smoke and flames instantly filling the small space. In the same motion, he grabbed Eliza's arm, pulling her toward the door and shoving the precious contract back into her hands. He shouted at the others to run. A gunshot exploded in the confusion, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Dugan, firing blindly into the smoke. Eliza felt a sharp tug at Taza's side as he pushed her out into the night. They ran, plunging into the darkness of the canyon. the shouts and curses of Crowley and his men echoing behind them. They did not stop until they were deep in the labyrinth of rocks, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They found refuge in a shallow, sandy wash, hidden from view by a curtain of drooping willow branches. The adrenaline began to fade, and in the sudden, ringing silence, Eliza could hear Taza's harsh, ragged breathing. He leaned heavily against the rock wall and slowly slid to the ground. In the faint starlight filtering through the branches, she saw the dark, wet stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt. He had been hit. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his shoulder, a long, ugly graze, but it had missed the bone. She ripped a long strip from the bottom of her petticoat, her hands finally steady. She knelt beside him, pressing the makeshift bandage against the wound to stanch the bleeding. He winced, a sharp intake of breath, but did not make another sound. He looked at her, his dark eyes full of a fierce, unwavering light. In the shared danger, in the quiet intimacy of this hidden place, all barriers between them dissolved. There was no white woman, no Apache warrior. There were only two people, bound by a shared fight and a trust that was now absolute. She tied the bandage, her touch gentle, and in the deep quiet of the canyon, they waited for the dawn, knowing that the battle for the valley had just begun. The sun was high and unforgiving by the time they reached the outskirts of Sweetwater. Taza's shoulder was stiff, the bandage a stark white against his dark skin, but his stride was even and his face was set like stone. Eliza walked beside him, the contracts in the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tucked securely in her saddlebag. She felt no fear, only a cold, clear sense of purpose. They were not returning to hide. They were returning to finish it. As they approached the town's main street, the sound they had been waiting for began to ring out, a clear, insistent clang that cut through the midday heat. The church bell. Reverend Hale was keeping his promise. People emerged from their homes and businesses, drawn by the urgent summons. They gathered in the dusty plaza in front of the small white church, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. By the time Eliza, Taza, and Kohana walked into the center of the growing crowd, the space was filled with the entire population of Sweetwater. Silas Crowley and Sheriff Dugan pushed their way to the front, their expressions a mixture of surprise and smug anger. They had expected her to run. Reverend Hale stood on the church steps, his usual timidity replaced by a righteous fire. He held up his hand for silence. He announced that a great injustice had been done, not just to one woman, but to the entire community. And the time for truth had come. He unrolled a piece of paper, the witness statement he had written the night before, and in a voice that grew stronger with every word, he read aloud Silas Crowley's boastful confession, the callous admission of his role in the mine disaster that had killed Samuel Hart and 11 other men. A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd of miners, before the murmur could swell into a roar. Martha Bell stepped forward, her own ledger held high. She was not a preacher, but she spoke with the unshakable authority of a woman who dealt in facts and figures. She faced the crowd, not Crowley, and laid out the evidence of the water theft. Her voice sharp and precise as she detailed the discrepancies in the deliveries and the systematic draining of the public well. She finished by pointing a finger directly at Crowley. She said he had not just stolen water, he had stolen the security of every family in the valley, and he had done it for profit. The 3 miners who had been with them at the pump house stepped forward, their faces grim. One of them, a man whose brother had died in the collapse, spoke of the cheap dynamite, his voice thick with a grief that had festered for a year. He held up the manifest with the rail office seal for all to see. Finally, Eliza stepped into the center of the circle. She did not shout. She did not need to. She simply unrolled the contract, the proof of the secret pipe, and held it up. She told them how Crowley had tried to choke her land dry, how he had set fire to her barn, how he had threatened her, all to gain control of the water that rightfully belonged to her, and to them. Crowley, seeing the tide of public opinion turning against him with a shocking speed, reverted to his most trusted tools, bluster and bribery. He laughed, a sound that rang false in the tense air. He called them all fools. He waved a hand dismissively at the evidence, calling it lies and exaggerations. He spoke of the future, of the prosperity the railroad would bring. He promised jobs, higher wages, a direct line to the markets in the East. He was painting a beautiful picture of a future built on his terms, paid for with their silence. Eliza met his gaze, her own voice cutting through his promises like a knife. She asked what good were jobs to dead men. She spoke Samuel's name, clear and loud, and the names of 2 other miners who had perished beside him. The names hung in the air, a stark and somber roll call of the true cost of Crowley's progress. The crowd was a sea of uncertain faces, caught between the lure of prosperity and the pull of justice. It was then that Taza spoke for the first time. He stepped forward, his wounded shoulder held stiffly. He did not look at Crowley. He looked at the farmers, at the ranchers, at the men and women whose lives were tied to the cycles of rain and drought. He said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the plaza, that the land has its own laws, older than any written by men in a distant capital. He said that water is life, and it belongs to all who live on the land. He finished by saying that a man who breaks this law is an enemy to all people. He had spoken for less than a minute, but everyone in that sun-scorched plaza understood the fundamental truth of his words. Sheriff Dugan, seeing his patron's power evaporating, made a desperate, foolish move. He decided to create a diversion, to give the crowd a familiar villain to unite against. He pointed a trembling finger at Taza. He bellowed that this Apache was the real problem, a troublemaker, a vagrant who was inciting a riot. He drew his pistol and took a step forward, declaring he was arresting Taza for disturbing the peace. In the confusion, one of Dugan's 2 deputies, a nervous young man eager to prove himself, drew his own weapon and pointed it squarely at Kohana. The sight of a gun aimed at a boy sent a collective gasp through the crowd. Before anyone could react, Eliza moved. She threw herself in front of Kohana and Taza, her arms spread wide, her body a human shield. She stared down the barrel of the gun, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She told them they would not touch him. The crowd was frozen, a single body holding its breath, teetering on the edge of violence and conscience. And then, the balance shifted. A man near the front of the crowd, a large rancher named Henderson, who had been one of Crowley's most vocal supporters, cleared his throat. He had been silent until now, his face a mask of conflict. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, not to the sheriff, but to his deputy. He said, "Put it down, son." His eyes were on Eliza. He said that just last week, his own young daughter had been playing near Eliza's ranch and had grown thirsty. Eliza had given her a cool drink from her well and had asked for nothing in return. Henderson looked at the fear in Kohana's eyes, and then at Sheriff Dugan. He said that the woman who gives water to a thirsty child is not the one causing the trouble here. It was as if a spell had been broken. Henderson's words, a simple testament to a small act of kindness, had done what all the evidence and accusations could not. It had reminded them of who they were, of the simple decency that bound them together as a community. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Taza saw the change. He knew this was the moment to end it, not with blood, but with honor. He gently moved Eliza aside. He slowly, deliberately, placed his bow and his knife on the ground. He stood before the armed sheriff, completely vulnerable, and held up his empty hands. He looked at the faces in the crowd, at the men and women who had been ready to condemn him just moments before. He said that if someone needed to be arrested to keep the peace, then they should arrest him, but they must not allow anyone to steal their water. This act of quiet courage, of selfless sacrifice, was a final, devastating blow to Dugan's and Crowley's authority. It made their brandished weapons look like the tools of frightened bullies. The shame was palpable. One of the miners, the one who had lost his brother, was coiling a length of rope in his hands. With a sudden, fluid motion, he flicked his wrist, and the rope snaked out. wrapping itself around Sheriff Dugan's gun hand and yanking the pistol from his grasp. It clattered to the dust. Dugan stood there, disarmed and utterly humiliated. Crowley looked around, his face a mask of disbelief and panic. His power, which had seemed so absolute, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. His hired men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began to melt away into the crowd. Just then, a man in a dusty suit pushed his way to the front. It was Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer from the county seat. Reverend Hale, with remarkable foresight, had sent for him 2 days ago. Abernathy held up a law book and read, in a clear and official voice, the territorial statute that allowed for the temporary detainment of any individual suspected of conspiracy, fraud, and incitement to violence, pending the arrival of a circuit judge. He looked at Silas Crowley. A pair of the miners stepped forward and took Crowley by the arms. He did not resist. Sheriff Dugan, stripped of his badge on the spot by a newly emboldened town councilman, was taken into custody as well. The immediate crisis was over. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd. All around the plaza, guns were slowly, quietly being holstered. The tension broke, replaced by a dazed sense of victory. Then, someone remembered they were thirsty. The town well was a source of shame, a symbol of their collective victimization. But there was another well, one by one. Then, in a small stream, the people began to move. They walked, not to their homes, but toward Eliza's ranch. They formed a quiet, orderly line at her well. Martha Bell was there, and Reverend Hale, and the miners, and even Henderson, with his young daughter by his side. They were not just drawing water. They were performing a ritual. They were washing away the lies, anointing their newfound unity, and affirming that in this harsh and unforgiving land, the most sacred thing of all was the water they shared. The day after the storm broke was quiet. The raw, angry energy of the confrontation had dissipated, leaving behind a stillness that felt both weary and clean. The first order of business was the well. Not just Eliza's, but the town's, a group of miners, their faces still grim with the memory of their fallen brothers, went to work with shovels and pry bars, unearthing the secret pipe that had been bleeding the community dry. They worked with a focused, silent anger, ripping the iron artery from the earth as if it were a parasite. They filled the trench, packed the earth, and by midday, it was as if the scar had never been there. The town was taking back what was stolen. In Sweetwater, a different kind of healing was taking place. Martha Bell stood behind the counter of her store, her ledger open not for business, but for absolution. One by one, the widows of the men who had died in the mine collapse came in. Martha drew a thick, dark line through the pages detailing their debts. The flour, the beans, the sugar that had kept their families alive on credit were now gifts. It was a quiet revolution, a rejection of the cold calculus of profit and loss that Crowley had championed. The community, fractured by suspicion and fear, was beginning to knit itself back together, stitch by painful stitch. That evening, a profound peace settled over Eliza's small ranch. The world seemed to be breathing a long, slow sigh of relief. Kohana, exhausted by the events of the past days, had fallen asleep by the hearth almost immediately after supper. Eliza sat at the kitchen table, cleaning her lantern, the familiar task a soothing balm on her raw nerves. Taza sat in a chair across from her, his back to the low-burning fire, watching the play of shadows on the wall. The bandage on his shoulder was clean, the wound beneath it beginning the slow, itchy process of mending. He shifted uncomfortably, a slight grimace touching his lips. Eliza noticed. She put down her cloth and walked over to him. Without speaking, she gently placed her hand on the linen bandage covering his shoulder. Her touch was light, a mere whisper of contact, yet it seemed to carry a weight of unspoken gratitude, of shared history, of a bond forged in fire and moonlight. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face. She found her voice, and the words that came out were not the ones she had planned. but the ones her heart needed to say. She told him, her voice barely a whisper, that he could stay in this house for as long as he wished. It was not an invitation for a guest. It was a statement of fact. This was his home now, if he chose it. Taza did not reply, but a deep, quiet light came into his eyes, an answer more profound than any word. She pulled a low stool over and sat before the hearth, holding her hands out to the warmth of the embers. Taza moved his chair to sit beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the chirping of crickets outside in the night. The door of the cabin was unbolted. It had been, ever since the night of the hailstorm. But tonight the unlocked door felt different. It was no longer a temporary concession to a crisis. It was a symbol of a new and permanent trust. Taza turned his head, his gaze so direct and intense that Eliza felt it like a physical touch. He asked, his voice a low rumble, a simple question that held a world of meaning. "Is this okay?" He was not just asking about this moment, about them sitting so close in the firelight. He was asking about everything, about the future, about the unspoken feelings that had grown between them in the spaces between fear and survival. Eliza met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but certain. "It is." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. He closed the small space between them, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of a sudden, desperate passion, but of a slow, dawning recognition. It was gentle and deep, and full of a quiet reverence. It spoke of shared hardship and mutual respect, of two solitary souls who had found an anchor in each other. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, and they simply breathed together in the warm, safe space they had created. A sudden, sharp rap on the door made them both jump. They pulled back, blinking, as if coming out of a dream. Kohana's voice, muffled by the wood, called out. He was asking if there was any cornbread left. Eliza looked at Taza, a slow smile spreading across her face, and he answered with a soft, low chuckle. The moment of profound intimacy was broken, not with a crash, but with the simple, grounding reality of a hungry boy. The tension that had been building for weeks finally dissolved, not in a storm, but in shared, gentle laughter. Later, after Kohana had been given his cornbread and had retreated back to his blankets, the conversation turned to the future. Taza spoke of the mountains, of his mother and the elders of his family. He said that once he knew she was truly safe, he had to return. He had a duty, a promise to his brother to look after their people. He spoke not of leaving, but of a journey he was obligated to make. Eliza listened, her heart aching at the thought of him gone. But she understood. His sense of honor was one of the things she admired most about him. She thought of her own life, of the roots she had put down in this hard, unforgiving soil. She looked at him in the firelight, at the strength and kindness in his face, and she saw not an ending, but a new and uncharted path. She said that when things were settled, truly settled, and he was ready to make that journey, perhaps she could go with him. She wanted to see the mountains he spoke of, to meet the people who had shaped the man he was, the line between her world and his, which had once seemed an impassable chasm, now felt like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The legal machinery, once set in motion, moved with a surprising swiftness. The circuit judge arrived in Sweetwater a week later, after reviewing Reverend Hale's testimony, Martha Bell's ledger, and the contracts Eliza had recovered. He formally certified the detainment of Crowley and Dugan. They would be held in the county jail until the full territorial court could convene in the fall. The threat was not gone, but it was caged. At the lawyer Abernathy's suggestion, Eliza filed a formal claim with the Territorial Land Office, not just for her property, but for the water rights to the aquifer beneath it. The petition was co-signed by Henderson and a dozen other ranchers and farmers. The community, which Crowley had tried to use as his weapon, had become her shield. One evening, as Eliza stood on her porch, she listened to the sounds of the night. It was no longer a menacing silence. She could hear the rhythmic scrape of a hoe from her garden, where Taza was clearing a new patch of ground for a late-season planting. The sound was a promise, a quiet testament to a future being built, one patient motion at a time. The hearth fire burned brightly inside, a beacon of warmth and safety in the vast, dark desert, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. Two people who had once been profoundly alone had found their way home. The rains came in late summer, not with the sudden, violent fury of a hailstorm, but as a slow, steady gift from a slate-gray sky. For 3 days, a gentle drumming on the roof of the cabin was the only sound that mattered. The parched earth, cracked and thirsty, drank deeply, its color darkening from pale tan to a rich, loamy brown. The air itself felt different, washed clean of the dust and tension, thick with the sweet, heavy scent of wet creosote and damp soil. On the second day of the rain, Eliza and Taza were outside, their clothes soaked through, their faces turned up to the sky. They worked together, digging shallow trenches with hoes to guide the precious runoff from the high ground into the newly plowed bean field. The water, a muddy, life-giving torrent, filled the channels and began to soak into the rows. They moved with an easy, unspoken rhythm, two figures working as one, their movements a dance of shared purpose. At one point, Eliza slipped in the slick mud, landing softly in a puddle. Taza reached down to help her up, but she was already laughing, a free, unburdened sound that mingled with the patter of the rain. He pulled her to her feet, his own face breaking into a rare, wide smile. And for a moment they just stood there, ankle-deep in mud and blessed water, laughing together on the land that had once been a battleground and was now becoming a garden. The news from the county seat arrived a week later, carried by Reverend Hale, who rode out looking 10 years younger. The circuit judge had heard the case. Silas Crowley, stripped of his arrogance and his allies, had been found guilty of embezzlement, conspiracy, and the willful destruction of private property. He was to serve a long sentence in the territorial prison. Daniel Dugan, in exchange for his testimony against his former patron, was spared a cell, but he was stripped of his office and banished from the county, a man without power or reputation. The law, which had once seemed like a weapon to be used against the weak, had finally served the cause of justice, a heavy chapter in the life of Sweetwater, and in Eliza's own life, had finally been closed. As the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, Taza spoke again of the mountains. It was time, he said, for him to keep his promise. But this time, it was not a declaration of departure. He asked Eliza and Kohana to come with him. The journey was a revelation for Eliza. They traveled for 2 days, climbing out of the familiar desert basin and into a world of towering pines, whispering aspens, and cool, clear streams. The air was thin and sharp, and the silence was different, filled with the hum of insects and the distant call of a hawk. The summer camp of Taza's people was not a village of permanent structures, but a collection of brush shelters and hide lodges nestled in a high meadow, a place that could be inhabited and then left without a scar. It was a community that lived with the land, not on it. Eliza felt a wave of apprehension, the old fears of a stranger in a strange world rising in her. But the welcome they received was not hostile, nor was it effusively friendly. It was a quiet, dignified acceptance. They were given a lodge, and food was shared with them. The most important meeting took place the next day. Taza led Eliza to a lodge where an old woman sat by a small fire, her face a beautiful, intricate map of a long and difficult life. This was his mother. She did not speak English, and Eliza did not speak Apache. Taza said a few quiet words to her. The old woman's eyes, as dark and deep as Taza's, studied Eliza for a long, silent moment. She looked at Eliza's hands, noting the calluses from her work. She looked at her face, reading the lines of grief and resilience there. Then, she gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of warmth, but of profound, elemental recognition. She had seen the woman who stood beside her son, and she had accepted her. Their time in the mountains was a period of gentle learning. Eliza, at the request of several of the young mothers, began to teach the children their English letters, drawing the shapes in the dirt and speaking the sounds slowly and clearly. In return, Taza and some of the other men taught her more of their own skills. They showed her which plants were good for medicine, how to find water by watching the flight of birds, and how to move through the forest without a sound. It was not a process of assimilation, but one of mutual exchange, a weaving together of two different kinds of knowledge, two different ways of seeing the world. Before they left to return to the valley, Taza's mother came to Eliza. She held out her hand, and in her palm was a small deerskin pouch. Inside was a handful of corn seeds, the kernels a deep, vibrant blue, unlike any Eliza had ever seen. The old woman spoke a few words, which Taza translated. She said this was the corn of her people, carried with them for generations. It was strong seed, and it would grow well in the valley soil. It was a gift of immense value, a trust placed in Eliza's hands. Back at the ranch, Eliza took the blue seeds and mixed them in a large wooden bowl with the pale yellow seeds from her own stock. The two colors swirled together, a promise of a new kind of harvest, a crop that would be a child of both of their worlds. It was a few weeks later that Eliza began to suspect a strange weariness in the afternoons, a new and unfamiliar tenderness in her body. The realization dawned on her slowly, and with it came not just a surge of joy, but a cold, sharp spike of fear. The memory of Samuel's death, of the brutal suddenness with which a life could be extinguished, rose up like a ghost. To bring a new life into this world felt like an act of terrifying vulnerability. She kept the knowledge to herself for days, a secret that was both wonderful and heavy. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally told Taza. She watched his face, her heart hammering. He did not shout for joy. He saw the fear in her eyes, and he understood it. He reached out and took her hand, his own large and warm and steady. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply held her hand and began to breathe, a slow, deep rhythm. He told her to breathe with him, in and out, in and out. She followed his lead, her frantic thoughts slowly quieting, the rhythm of her own breath matching his. He did not try to banish her fear. He simply sat with her in the middle of it, a calm, solid presence, until the fear began to recede, making room for a fragile, growing hope. The changes in their own small family were mirrored by a larger change in the valley. On the porch of the church, the place where the confrontation had reached its climax, the ranchers and farmers of Sweetwater gathered to create a new law. They drafted a community water compact, a simple document that declared the valley's water a shared public trust, to be managed for the good of all, not the profit of a few. It outlawed the secret siphoning of water and established a council to oversee its fair distribution. It was a law born from the ground up, a testament to the hard lesson they had all learned. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable, happy routine. One afternoon, Kohana returned from a hunting trip, proudly holding up a single, scrawny rabbit, having missed 3 others. That evening, as he recounted his adventure, Eliza declared a new household rule, the law of the kitchen. She called it, anyone who went hunting and missed their shot was responsible for washing the cooking pots for a week. Kohana groaned in protest, but Taza laughed, a deep, easy sound that filled the small, warm cabin. It was the sound of a family, a real one, with its own history, its own private jokes, and its own simple, unshakable laws. The quiet, steady work of building a life, a real and lasting one, had truly begun. And so, our story comes to its close, not with the sharp report of a final gunshot, but with the gentle, steady rhythm of life taking root in a hard-won peace. A story, you see, is a journey. And this one began in a place of profound loneliness, with a single woman, Eliza Hart, silhouetted against a vast and indifferent desert. Her world was small, fortified by fences and fear, her days a quiet ritual of survival against the land and the memory of loss. The inciting event was not a declaration of war, but a quiet question asked on the wind of a dust storm, a plea for shelter from a giant of a man who should have been a figure of terror but was instead a figure of weary dignity. That was the seed from which everything grew. The rising action was not a series of grand battles, but a slow, careful weaving of trust. It was built in shared lessons, his knowledge of the land for her knowledge of the written word. It was tested by fire, in the smoky ruin of a burned barn, and it was solidified in a secret quest for justice, following a stolen artery of iron pipe under a cold moon. The climax, when it came, was not a duel at high noon in a dusty street. It was a showdown of conscience in the town square, a moment where an entire community was forced to look at itself and choose between the easy poison of prejudice and the hard-won clarity of truth. The falling action was a time of mending, of patching roofs and patching lives, of a locked door finally left open and a first, hesitant kiss by a warm hearth. And the end, the true end, was the return of the seasonal rains, a promise kept by the sky, washing the land clean and allowing a new kind of family and a new set of laws to flourish. The people who walked this path were at the heart of it all. At its center was Eliza, a woman who began our story as a victim of circumstance, a widow defined by her fear of Silas Crowley and the ghosts of her past. Her journey was one of finding her own strength, of moving from a defensive crouch to a righteous stand. She learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of taking another's hand in the dark. Her goal was simple, to keep her home and her dignity. And in the end, she built a home for others and became a leader of her community. Beside her stood Taza, a man walking a difficult line between his duty to protect his own and his vow to avoid the white man's violence. He entered the story as a wary traveler seeking only temporary shelter, a man trying to stay out of a fight, but his innate sense of honor, his deep understanding of the land's true laws, would not allow him to stand by in the face of injustice. He became a protector, not just of his young cousin, but of an entire valley's right to live. Against them were Silas Crowley and his puppet, Sheriff Dugan, men who represented a different kind of law, the law of greed and force, who saw land not as a home but as a commodity, and people as either tools or obstacles. And around them all was the small world of Sweetwater, a community of supporting players like the steadfast Martha Bell and the conscience-stricken Reverend Hale, and young Kohana, who grew from a curious boy into a responsible young man. Each character was forced to make a choice, to decide which law they would live by. The conflicts they faced were as layered as the rock of the Arizona canyons. The most visible was the direct struggle between Eliza and Taza's small group and the forces of Crowley, a classic battle of the vulnerable against the powerful. But beneath that lay the deeper struggles. Eliza fought a war within herself, a battle against her own trauma and the ingrained prejudices she had been taught all her life. Taza fought a similar internal battle, weighing his desire for peace against his warrior's instinct to protect the innocent. This was a story steeped in the social conflicts of its time, the bitter prejudice against the Apache people, and the relentless, soul-crushing advance of industrial might, represented by the railroad, which sought to conquer and consume the land rather than live with it. And always, there was the conflict with nature itself, the unforgiving sun, the sudden, violent storms, the constant, desperate search for water, the very element that meant the difference between life and death. The technology of the railroad and its stolen pipes represented a new kind of power, a mechanical force that threatened to overwhelm the older, more organic rhythms of the land. Through these struggles, certain themes emerged, like water from a deep well. This was a story about how freedom and justice are not gifts from on high, but things that must be built from the ground up by a community willing to stand together. It was about the nature of a mature love, a love that is not about rescue or possession, but about respect, consent, and the quiet, steady work of healing. It was a story about how a family is not always a matter of blood, but can be forged by choice, in the crucible of shared hardship. And at its very core, it was a story about water, In the arid West, water is life. It is power. It is the sacred order of things, and the fight to control it was a fight for the soul of the valley. The setting was more than a backdrop. It was a character in its own right. The story could only have happened in that specific time and place. The Arizona territories in the early 1880s, a land of harsh beauty and flimsy laws, where a person's character was their most valuable currency. The small, isolated ranch, the dusty town, the church, and the secret pump house were the stages upon which these dramas played out, each location shaping the choices the characters made. I tried to tell this story in a plain voice, staying close to the thoughts and feelings of Eliza and Taza, to keep the language simple and rich with the details of the land. I wanted the humor to be gentle and born of real life, like Kohana's naming of the rooster, to provide moments of grace and relief from the constant tension. A story lives in its symbols, in the small images that carry a larger meaning. The door to Eliza's cabin, at first bolted and barred, became a symbol of her heart, slowly unlatching until it was left open in a gesture of absolute trust. The well, the pipe, the water itself were symbols of life and the moral right to exist. The hearth fire was a place of healing and confession. The seasonal rain, when it finally came, was a symbol of grace, of a world washing itself clean. And the corn seeds, the blue from his people and the yellow from hers, mixed together in a bowl, were a powerful symbol of a new, shared future, a harvest that would belong to both of them. The rhythm of the story was meant to mirror the land itself, starting slow and patient, letting the tension build like the pressure before a storm. The action, when it came, was not meant to be a celebration of violence, but a necessary consequence of the choices made. The dialogue was sparse, because in that time and place, actions often spoke louder and more truthfully than words. The key turning points were not loud explosions, but quiet shifts of the heart. The surprise of the giant, gentle warrior asking for help. The shock of Crowley's public confession, brought on by his own arrogance. And the true climax, the final, tide-turning moment, was not a gun being fired, but a man's simple recollection of a child being given a drink of water. In the end, the meaning of this story is not that a hero with a fast gun can solve all problems. It is that justice requires the collective courage of ordinary people. It is that love does not save us from ourselves, but rather creates a safe harbor where we can find the strength to save each other. And it is that hope, like a resilient crop of corn, can spring from the hardest ground. As long as people are willing to work together, to share what they have, and to protect the water that gives life to all. Thank you for listening to our story, and we invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.